It begins with an old photograph, the kind you find curled and yellowed at the edges, buried in a shoebox under moth-eaten quilts. In it, 3 generations stand together on the porch of a sagging Ozark farmhouse. At first glance, they look like any poor rural family of the early 20th century, but the longer you stare, the more your stomach tightens. Their faces, eerily similar, eyes set too close, chins fading into nothing, mouths frozen in uneasy half-smiles, as though someone told them to pretend at normal. That photograph should never have made it out of the house, yet here it is, whispering the truth that the family and the town spent decades trying to bury. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The story you're about to hear happened in the shadows of the Ozark Mountains, where roads twist like secrets, and the trees themselves seem to lean in, listening. It's the story of a single bloodline, confined to one roof for over 3 generations. What began as survival in isolation slowly warped into something else. A legacy of inbreeding that left its mark in bone, mind, and memory. People in the neighboring towns knew about the family, but they didn't talk about it openly. At least, not where it could be heard. You might catch a whisper in the corner booth of a diner or a knowing look between old men at the feed store, but mention their name too loudly and you'd be met with silence, that kind of silence that tells you you've crossed a line. The house itself still stands, or rather, what's left of it. Weathered boards, a roof caving in under the weight of decades. If you didn't know better, you might think it was abandoned. But if you were there in the late 1930s, you'd have seen it live with shadows moving in the windows. A grandfather who was also a great-uncle. A mother whose mother was also her aunt. Children who could never fully explain how their parents were related, and all of them under one roof, because that's how it had always been. But behind those walls, something else grew, something you couldn't see in a census record or a family Bible. It grew in the way they looked at outsiders, in the strange cadence of their voices, in the unspoken understanding that no one ever left and no one ever came in. The first signs were physical, but no one dared to speak them aloud. The children were born small, with pale, almost translucent skin. Some had crossed eyes so severe they seemed to stare in 2 directions at once. Others had jaws that never quite lined up, making their speech soft, slurred, and difficult for strangers to understand. But here, inside these mountains, strangers rarely came, and when they did, they didn't stay long. The older folks in town, those with memories that went back before the Great Depression, could tell you when it started. A bitter winter, a failed crop, and a small cluster of families retreating deeper into the hills to survive. Out there was no church, no schoolhouse, no general store, just kin marrying kin, because there was no one else. The logic was simple at first: keep the bloodline pure, keep the land in the family, but bloodlines don't just keep the good, they keep everything. And generation after generation, the walls around that roof grew tighter. It wasn't just the faces that told the story, it was the way the family moved together, almost as a single organism. They rarely split apart, even for work. Men worked the same patch of rocky soil their fathers had, their bent backs mirrored in the next row over. Women cooked in the same blackened cast-iron pots their mothers had stirred. Conversations happened in murmurs, often in a dialect so twisted by isolation it was barely recognizable to outsiders. The few who had entered the home, doctors, traveling preachers, county officials, spoke of a feeling that clung to the air inside, not just the smell of wood smoke and damp earth, but a heaviness. They said the family rarely made direct eye contact, as though looking at you too long might reveal something dangerous, and maybe it would, because in this house, truth was dangerous. Truth meant confronting what everyone already knew, and no one wanted to say. Children born here didn't just inherit features, they inherited roles. Daughters became wives to men they'd known since birth, uncles became fathers to their own nieces, and cousins grew up as siblings without anyone telling them otherwise. By the time the third generation was born under that roof, the lines between parent, sibling, aunt and cousin had blurred beyond recognition. And in a place where identity was built entirely on blood, no one considered that the blood itself might be the curse. By the mid-1940s, the family had become a quiet legend in the surrounding counties, a kind of whispered cautionary tale parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far into the hills. But legends have roots, and this one was buried deep beneath decades of secrecy. It was during this time that an itinerant schoolteacher, Miss Eliza Thornton, first stepped across the threshold of the house. She'd been sent by the county to assess why the children weren't attending school. The official reason was truancy. The unofficial reason was far more unsettling. She later wrote in her private journal, never intended for public eyes, that when the door opened, she felt as though she'd been pulled into a place where time had stopped, or perhaps never existed at all. Inside, she saw 3 generations living together in 2 cramped rooms. The oldest man, stooped, with hair as white as the linens hanging to dry, watched her with an expression that hovered between suspicion and exhaustion. Beside him, a middle-aged woman, who might have been his daughter, or his niece, stirred something thick and grey in a pot over the hearth. And scattered around them, children of various ages stood barefoot on warped floorboards, all with the same set of pale eyes and slack mouths, as though they'd been cast from the same mould. Miss Thornton tried to speak to them, asked for their names, their ages, but most only stared in silence. A few whispered in voices so low she could barely hear, and their words were tangled in a dialect she could hardly decipher. She noted their schooling level was years behind their ages, some unable to write their names, others unable to read a single word. But what unsettled her most wasn't the lack of education, it was the way they clung to one another. If she addressed one child, another would answer. If she asked where their father was, a cousin would point to a man who might have been both father and uncle at once. When she left, she carried with her more questions than answers. In her report to the county, she described unsuitable living conditions and family ties too close for the comfort of law. But the report went nowhere. Out here, in the folds of the Ozarks, the law moved slowly, and sometimes not at all. And so the house kept its secrets, and the bloodline remained unbroken. By the early 1950s, the weight of the family's isolation began to show in ways that even the town could no longer ignore. Health problems, strange, persistent, and generational, were surfacing with increasing frequency. Joints that swelled without reason, hearing that faded before middle age, and bouts of confusion or sudden anger that would come and go like storms. Outsiders might have called them symptoms, the family called them spells, and they were endured in silence. The local doctor, a man named Robert Alden, had tended to the family for nearly 20 years. He was one of the few outsiders who could walk through their door without fear. In his notes, kept locked away in a leather case, he wrote of patterns he could not ignore. Children resemble one another as siblings, though records indicate otherwise. Birth defects common. Certain mannerisms and speech patterns present in nearly every member across generations. But Dr. Alden never took his findings to the county, not because he didn't care, but because he knew what would happen. Out here, a family's business was its own, and bringing the law, or worse, the newspapers, would only lead to the family vanishing deeper into the hills. The farm itself was shrinking. Rocky soil and thin harvests meant less food each year, and yet no one took work in town. Pride played a part, but there was also a deeper reason. The outside world didn't feel safe to them. Stories circulated of family members who had tried to leave, only to return months later, broken in spirit, muttering about how they didn't fit anywhere else. Neighbors, if you could call them that, spoke of strange sounds at night. Laughter, too loud and too long, echoing through the trees. Sometimes they claimed they saw figures on the roof under a full moon, sitting in silence, watching the road below. No one dared to confront them directly. There was talk that The family Bible, handed down through the generations, no longer recorded births and deaths in the usual way. Instead of full names, there were initials, sometimes just a single letter. The truth had been reduced to codes only the family understood, ensuring that if the book was ever found, it would speak only to them. By now, the third generation had grown to adulthood under that sagging roof. They were raising children of their own, children who carried the same pale eyes, the same narrow jaws, the same unspoken rules about who they could love and who they could not. The bloodline was still unbroken, but so was the curse. By the 1960s, the family had become a living ghost story, one you could almost believe was exaggerated until you saw them yourself. The Ozarks were changing, roads were being paved, electricity crept deeper into the hills, and outsiders were starting to settle nearby. But the house at the end of the dirt road stayed the same. Its windows remained dark at night, even after the county ran power lines past its gate. The family refused the connection, saying they had no need for it. Some suspected it wasn't stubbornness, but fear that light from within might reveal too much to those outside. This was the decade when the last known attempt to intervene took place. A young social worker, Margaret Hill, armed with determination and a camera, arrived unannounced one morning. She'd been sent after a tip-off about neglected minors living in the house. When she stepped out of her car, she noticed all the curtains drawn tight, even though the summer sun was already burning the air. She knocked once, twice. Then the door opened, and a wall of eyes met hers. She later told a colleague that what struck her most was not deformity, but uniformity. Faces so alike, they seemed to blend together, like variations of the same face, stretched or shrunken by age. Margaret asked to come in, and to her surprise, they allowed it. She took careful steps across the sagging boards, her camera at her side, but every time she raised it, someone would step between her and her subject. The air inside was heavy with the smell of damp wood and something metallic, blood, perhaps from an animal recently butchered. In the corner, a young woman nursed a baby while an older man, perhaps in his 50s, but with the stooped frame of someone much older, watched silently from a chair. Margaret noticed the way the child's hands trembled slightly, even in sleep. She asked questions, scribbling in her not-armed iPad, but the answers were evasive, circular. A child would be pointed out as his son in one sentence, her cousin in the next. She left after less than an hour, unsettled, with only a few blurry photographs taken when no one was looking. Her report described the situation as deeply abnormal and likely generational in nature. But like all reports before it, it went nowhere. The family's roof, its history, and its secrets remained intact. And outside, the Ozarks swallowed the sound of it all, like it always had. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? By the 1970s, time itself seemed to fray around the house. Neighbors claimed the family hadn't aged in the way others did. Faces stayed eerily familiar from one decade to the next, as if the same features were being copied and pasted onto each new child. It wasn't youth they carried, but a strange sameness, an unbroken loop that blurred the line between past and present. A local hunter named Frank Lawson told a story in a bar one night that spread like wildfire. He'd been tracking deer through the ridges when he saw smoke curling from the family's chimney. As he moved closer, he spotted figures in the yard, barefoot despite the frost. They were gathered around something on the ground. A gutted deer, he thought at first. But then he swore the shape was wrong, and the moment they noticed him, the group scattered into the house without a word. He never went near the property again. By now, rumors about the family had taken on a life of their own. Some said they practiced strange rituals to keep the blood strong. Others whispered that a child had been born with such severe deformities it had never left the house, living only in the dark back room where no outsider had ever stepped. Whether true or not, these stories built a kind of invisible fence around the family, one no one dared cross. Those who'd grown up hearing the tales often drove out to see the house for themselves. They'd park on the dirt road at night, daring one another to walk up the path. Most never made it to the porch. They said it wasn't the dark or the silence that stopped them. It was the feeling, as if dozens of eyes were watching from behind the curtains, following their every move. Inside, life went on as it always had, meals cooked over the same hearth, water doctor on from the same well, children born, raised and married without ever stepping outside the boundaries of blood. They did not see themselves as cursed, only protected from a world they neither trusted nor understood, a world that in truth had long since stopped trying to understand them. The roof still held, but the weight it carried was heavier than ever. By the 1980s, the family's story had drifted into that uneasy space between history and myth. The outside world was changing faster than ever. Satellite dishes sprouted on rooftops across the Ozarks, new highways cut through old trails, but the dirt road to the family's house looked the same as it had 50 years earlier. The shingles curled back, the porch leaned forward like it might collapse at any moment, and the same pale-eyed faces still appeared in the windows whenever a car slowed on the road below. The older generation began to vanish, not to hospitals or care homes, but quietly in their beds, surrounded by kin. They were buried on a slope behind the house, marked only by uncarved stones. No dates, no names, just the knowledge, passed down to the living, of who rested there. The middle generation, now the elders, took their place as keepers of the unspoken rules, and the youngest, they had never known anything different. To them, the roof was the world, and the blood beneath it was all there was. Occasionally, strangers still tried to reach them, genealogists, curious journalists, even thrill-seekers. Some were turned away at the door with nothing more than a flat stare. Others claimed to have been let inside, only to leave pale-faced and silent, refusing to speak about what they'd seen. A few came back years later, insisting the family had disappeared entirely, but the truth was more likely that the family had simply decided to close the door for good. The house itself became part of the landscape, like an old oak that refuses to fall. Decades of storms passed over it. Trees grew taller around it. The path to the porch became little more than 2 ruts in the grass, and yet smoke still rose from the chimney on cold mornings, proof that life, strange, insular, unbroken, still moved within. Today, if you ask about them in the nearby towns, you'll get one of 2 answers. The first is a shrug and a muttered, "Ain't my business." The second is a quiet, careful warning, "Best leave that place be." Because for all the changes in the world, one thing has never shifted, the belief that some stories are too heavy to carry, too tangled to unravel, and too dangerous to speak aloud. And so, the family remains under that same sagging roof, bound by the same blood, their lives unfolding in the shadows of the Ozarks, just as they always have.